What's going on, Real World PDR? Today we're going to take a look at this intermediate level fender damage, but we're going to do it a little different than I normally do. Hey, what's going on? This is Jim with Real World PDR. So today we're going to take a look at this fender dent. Now, it was brought up to me that I have a lot of Stanliner explanations with fender dents just like this. The problem with Stanliner tools is sometimes they're not all that available. They're kind of hard to get, and a lot of the ones that I have, frankly, are limited edition. So what we're going to do with this is I'm going to show you how to use just regular off-the-shelf tools from other tool companies to fix this kind of damage. So two tools that you would probably find me using in my shop if I had damage like this would be this. This is the Stanliner large fender tool. Now, if you can get your hands on one of these, it's basically like cheating on these fender dents if you have this. But I know they're hard to get a hold of, so we're not going to use that. Another tool that's much the same is this doodah. Now, you've seen me use that on some of this video content, but again, this is also kind of hard to get your hands on. What's not hard to get is this double bend from Dentcraft. Here I've got a very, very wide tip. That's what we're going to start doing this dent with. In this video, I'm going to show you how to use regular old tools, using the graduated system, paying attention to our dent map, how to fix something like this quickly and cleanly. So with a dent like this, what we're seeing is that this body line has been pushed in and some metal has been displaced this way. So our dent map, what are we looking at? What's our high pressure areas? Obviously, that's a pretty rough looking crown. My dent map for this, regardless of the tool that I'm using, is always going to stay roughly the same. So let's take a look at exactly how I'm going to manage this. So if we take a look at this crown right here, this is actually what I'm going to focus on the most. Even whenever I'm pushing, this is actually my goal. So whenever I'm pushing, I'm actually just trying to soften up that crown so I can replace as much of that displaced metal as possible. So while I'm pushing, you'll see me pay attention not only to bringing that body line up to reestablish that, but in this area right between the feature line and that crown. That's going to do the most for softening up this crown, which means when we start our knockdown and hammer work, that crown's going to flow a lot easier for us. This body line is about the only part of this fender that's going to want to work with us. So that's what we're going to attack first for two different reasons. First, I want to reestablish that as quickly in the repair as I can to make sure it stays nice and sharp. Furthermore, that's going to soften up this crown and I'll be able to flow that back, allowing some of this dent to repair itself. So let's take a look how we're going to do this. First things first, I'm going to take this very wide tip here and I'm going to work it all the way down this body line. Now what you should see happen is that this crown is going to soften up while I do that. From there, I'll probably push down here a little bit using that same tip, and then I'm going to graduate down to something like this. Now this is from VIP, this is actually a prototype, but it fits an R4 tip. So any tip that you have that fits an R4 will be just fine. So here's a trick that Chris covered in the Decoding Access series at realworldpdr.com. This is so simple, but if you turn the wheel a little bit, you can adjust the fulcrum point and get better leverage with your tool. Of course, better leverage, more control, better repair. So the tip that I'm going to start out with is this soft mushroom style tip. Because of the angle of attack, that tip is not going to hit this panel perfectly flat, but that's okay. It's still plenty soft to do the job. So you can see here, I'm working back and forth along that body line and focusing on that area between the body line and basically the start of the crown. Now, you can even see as I'm pushing here, that crown is starting to soften up. You can see how with every push, that crown actually flexes towards where I'm pushing. This crown wasn't super sharp to start out with, but it was still a little more V-shaped than I would have liked. By pushing this, by softening up, it's going to be more U-shaped, which means it's going to move a little bit better for us. Now, another thing that you very well might have missed because you were paying attention to the crown, which is good, is look at how much of the rest of this dent has already pulled itself together. The area below where I'm pushing has actually flattened itself out significantly. So that is what I'm talking about whenever I say let a dent repair itself. Make sure that the pushes that you're doing are smart because you can get a lot more done than just pinpoints of metal movement if you're smart about where you're pushing. The less that you have to push, the less chance you have of over pushing and the less cleanup work you have, which is what takes the longest with dents for the most part. Also, while I have caused a little bit of texture here in this pushing process, one thing that I definitely want to focus on is not over pushing simply because I have a soft tip on my rod. I screwed this up for way too long. I got really aggressive with soft tips, and that just causes more work for yourself in the future. So just because the tip is soft, don't over push. So that's it. That's our first round of pushing. Let's see what happened. In that couple minutes of pushing, we went from this, and we've made it look like this. That's a lot of movement with minimal effort because we did it smart. Now we're going to go ahead and focus on this crown. Now this, again, was the most important part of doing this repair in my opinion. We're going to start out with this clip in real time. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put real world super speed on this so you can see what actually happens. The hammer that I'm using is the 144 from Carbon-Tech. I've got the hubcap tip on one side and this VIP soft leather tip on the other. There was a time in my career that I would have used a slapper tapper to do this, but with the new tips and hammers that have come out on the market, this is much more convenient and much more effective without the big learning curve. The idea here is going to be to flow this crown without causing any additional damage that we have to clean up later. This is one of those times where slowing down to speed up is going to be important. That's why we're going to take a look at this in real world super speed directly after this clip. So now I've switched to that hubcap tip. Now this is a tip that I really like. It's nice and wide. It moves metal very flat. Also, because this is such a wide and flat tip, you can use that offset knockdown technique that I teach you at realworldpdr.com. It's one of my $1 million tips. This tip was originally made to work on crowns on motorcycle tanks, but it works so dang well that it has worked its way into my daily tool arsenal. Another thing I'd like to point out is that at this point you can see that I've spent far more time knocking down than I did pushing already. And that's going to be true of most of your retail dents and dings. Knocking down is actually significantly more important than the pushing you do generally. So now let's take a look at this clip sped up 800 times with real world super speed. At this speed you can actually see that crown move. So I've said it before and I'll say it a million more times, you need to trust the process and understand even if it doesn't look obvious that something's happening, it is. So this is before, this is after. Before, after. It works. So a few camera adjustments and a zoom in, and we're gonna do a little more knocking down on this little ridge that I could see whenever I zoom that camera in. Since you now have a good idea about how long this actually takes, I'm gonna go ahead and speed up this click 400% so you can see it move while I'm doing it. So what we've done so far is we have pushed up these lows with a very wide tip. We've knocked down this crown using very wide tip. So this is the VIP tip. This is the hubcap. Now I believe you can get this from Carbon-Tech. This one comes from VIP. So we're still going to continue in this same way, using as wide as we can tips for both pushing and knocking down. I'm actually going to graduate down to this edgy knocker tip to clean up some of these little bumps that we have here. What I'm trying to avoid is any over pushing with my pushing tips and any kind of dimples with my knockdown, because that's all stuff that I'll have to clean up later. Okay, now you can see me using this edgy knocker tip and pinpointing these small slight over pushes that I've created whenever I was pushing with that wide tip. So obviously the graduated system works very well for your pushing tips, but what you might not think of, and you should, is that knocking down, it's the same thing. This edgy knocker tip is one of the best that I have found to do this job. I believe it was made as a blending tip, but I really like it on my knockdowns. The same idea as that hubcap tip from Carbon-Tech is that it's wide and flat so I can knock down without causing a bunch of dimples. One thing to keep in mind whenever you're using this tip is that you have to hold it flat. So I'm going to zoom this camera way in so you can see exactly what the tip is doing and how I'm trying to angle it to make sure that it's very flat against the panel. If you hit it with the edge, it's going to cause a dimple. So graduating down to our next pushing tip, we're going to use this. So this happens to be from VIP, but there's a lot of different tips on the market that hold these red caps. Any of them would work just fine. So now we're going to graduate down to this tip here. And same thing, I'm just going to work, all the way. Close it down. This body line. So here you're going to see me use this R4 tip and work along this body line quite a bit. So what I'm trying to do here is reestablish again and try to make sure that body line stays sharp for the end of this repair. So with bigger tips, the trade-off is yes, you will get a softer push, but you lose a bit of accuracy. So while I'm pushing with this R4 tip, what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on the lows that are a little bit bigger, a little more obvious. I'm not going to try to get pinpoint accurate with this thing, but the lows between where I overpushed with, let's say, that mushroom tip should be big enough where I can connect the dots between them with this R4 tip. And now a lot of that playing connect the dots, you're going to see me use, very interestingly enough, a Stanliner technique, which is this interior blending technique, which I'm going to get into here in a second during this video. So even though I'm not using the Stanliner tools that I would normally use for this kind of repair, the techniques that I've learned while using Stanliner tools still cross over into my normal everyday pushing technique. So even if you don't have the tools, try to learn some of the techniques because they'll only make you better. Okay, in that last clip, you probably saw me pushing very quickly. Now I want to show you how I do that. That's actually the interior blending technique. Now, in this scenario, I'm using an R4 cap here to do this. So it doesn't have to be Stanliner, even though that's where I first learned that technique. So whenever you see me interior blending, let's see on a quarter panel, a lot of times you'll see me striking the tip against the panel like so, right? In this scenario, I'm actually bouncing the rod itself off the tire, okay? And because I can put my hand up here for a little bit extra accuracy, I'm actually pinching this tip a little bit and guiding it along that body line. So watch me do that here for a second. Bouncing the rod, sorry for the squeaking, and that's causing the driving of that metal. So the tip really isn't coming off of the back of that panel at all. I'm just kind of scooting it around exactly where I need it. And the beautiful thing is I'm not really going to over push with this because I'm not pushing hard. I'm just kind of letting that action move that metal. So I'll do a little bit more of that. I'll also knock down a little bit more, and then we'll probably graduate down once again. Still using the edgy knocker here. So one other thing to take note here is how long I'm sticking with one tool. So I'm still using this edgy knocker. I'm not in a rush to graduate down further. I want to push this as far as I can using the widest tip that I can, and that's going to keep it the cleanest. Obviously, I could be using a different knockdown here. I could have been using a sharper pushing tool, but by slowing down, it'll mitigate the chances of causing any additional damage that I have to clean up later. That being said, we are ready to graduate down in our pushing tip. So zoomed in here real close so you can see exactly what we're doing. We're going to switch to this bullet style tip. Honestly, have no idea where this one comes from. They're really, really common. So you can see all these tiny little lows that the R4 tip wouldn't have been accurate enough to pick up, but with this bullet style tip, it'll do just fine. Now we're getting to the beginning of what I would call cleanup work. So obviously this is sped up quite a bit. Reason being, this is a long process for cleanup. So watch my tip move here. You can see me targeting these tiny little lows. And as I start pushing those up, you can see how clean it starts to look. This is cleanup work, guys. There's no shortcuts here. This connecting the dots process is what you have to do when things don't come up perfectly smooth. This is why we try to keep things as clean as possible as the dent's coming up. So zooming out and slowing this down to real time, you can kind of get a feel for the cadence that I'm using to push this. How quickly am I pushing? Well, this is it. So it's still quite fast using that interior blending technique, but I still have to be pretty dang accurate. So we're gonna go ahead and speed this up some more, and you can watch it happen. At this speed, you can visualize the dent actually starting to clean up, but remember, this is sped up quite a bit. So during this process, this is another time that you just have to trust the process. It is going to clean up in time. So hopefully it's obvious to you now why keeping this dent as clean as humanly possible as it's coming up is going to be important. You can see how much time we've actually spent doing cleanup work at this point. This is why, in general, for these types of dents, when it's possible, I am using Stanliner tools and techniques, especially that large Fender tool. Using those tools and techniques really cuts down on the amount of time that you have to clean up. Also, you can see that I've switched to my hammer here. I do recommend that everybody get very proficient with your blending hammer. It'll also save you a lot of time. I could still use my knockdown here, but it would be a lot more time consuming. So here's a couple more views of this pushing, me using this interior blending technique. Notice how I'm actually bouncing that rod off the tire while my tip is actually maintaining contact with the back of the panel. Okay, so now I'm beyond the rough out process. I'm getting close to finishing this thing up. So I've used that graduated system. So I graduated down from that very, very big tip to an R4 tip to a regular bullet style tip, right? So I've got most of this picked up. All that I'm seeing now is kind of some ripply things going on. It looks like mild, very slight over pushes. So I'm gonna graduate down from the edgy knocker to something a little more precise, and that's gonna be this VIP tip. So I'm gonna go and I'm gonna smooth out some of that texture, and what should be left is just the little lows that I have to work on. Now, let me point something out, and this is something I tell all my in-person trainees, and they find it generally to be true. If you get to a point that you don't know what to do on a dent, 9 times out of 10, more than that, 99 times out of 100, the answer is you need to knock down. So remember that. When you're out practicing, maybe you picked up a retail job and you're getting a little overwhelmed and you don't know what to do next, most of the time, you're gonna wanna pick up your knockdown, you're gonna wanna flatten everything out, and give yourself a more honest view of what needs done. Generally, whenever you do an appropriate amount of knockdown, everything's gonna start to look much nicer and much more manageable. So now hopefully at this point you can see how small the texture is getting. The little highs are very little, the little lows are very little. And that's the goal here. We're gonna start with the broad strokes and we're gonna work our way all the way down to very, very fine work like we're doing here. Now, while this was a wholesale unit and absolute perfection wasn't expected or even guaranteed, it is absolutely possible. Simply by repeating this process of knocking down the tiny little highs and picking up the tiny little lows till there is no difference between the location of the former damage and the surrounding panel. It all boils down to how detailed you want to get. Now, when using the graduated system, ideally, you're going to graduate down linear and you're never going to go backwards, but that's not always possible or even the best move. So my next step here is after I get done doing some of this, I notice that there's some more wavy highs. So I'm going to go back to that edgy knocker and I'm going to use that. Now, on that note, let's talk about your knockdown tips. Now, I've said it before that knocking down is more important than pushing, and I mean that. Quite frankly, I would rather you have an amazing selection of knockdown tools than just every pushing tool on the market. To be quite frank with you, what I would do is I would log on to VIP's website, who I'm not affiliated with, and order every knockdown tip that they carry. Also, definitely get this edgy knocker tip because for this work, it is really clutch. So now back to pushing with this bullet tip. Now, thankfully, we've kept this clean enough that we really shouldn't have to get any sharper than using this. If there was an overabundance of little pits in there, we might have to go to an actually really sharp tip. But in general, this bullet tip will provide you plenty of accuracy. So again, we're going to go ahead and speed up this video clip. So many of you have asked for video on finishing work, and well, this is it. At this point, you just want to make sure that every push is as accurate and purposeful as it can be. Absolutely nothing should happen here that's going to create more work for you. So be very patient, slow down if you have to. So again, keeping in mind that this video is sped up significantly, what we're going to do is going to watch a little more of this, but now we're going to go ahead and skip to what happened, I would say probably 10-15 minutes later. So 10-15 minutes more of this. This is what it looks like. You can see it's coming together very, very nicely. Okay, a little adjustment on my camera settings. You can see this turned out real nice. Now, what I'm going to do from here is go ahead and cross-check, which is simply looking at this dent from another direction. Now, what should happen is I should see some lows that I more than likely missed while working it from this way. Let's go ahead and check that out. Okay, from our cross-check angle here, we can see that not too bad. As a matter of fact, instead of having lows, we kind of have this row of highs here. So I'm going to go ahead and knock those down, see what kind of improvement that gets us. So with the exception of that little line of highs, our cross-check really wasn't that bad, which is great. Now, one thing to do to make sure that your cross-check looks good is move your head in light position a lot throughout your repair. So it's pretty apparent at this point that this repair is coming together. We're almost done. There's some very small waves and a little bit of a texture that I'm going to go ahead and take care of using my blending hammer here, which quite frankly is how I end most of my dents. Pull the light back at a pretty severe angle, make sure it's close to the panel, get your body and your eyeballs as close to the panel as possible, and all of those tiny little waves are going to illuminate themselves for you, and that little bit of extra work at the very end stages here can make a pretty big difference in the way your dent looks. So let's take a quick peek of where we're at versus where we were. Again, this is not how I would normally go about repairing this dent. But what I did is use some very attainable pushing tools and some good knockdown tools. And even without the fancier stuff, the results still speak for themselves. Okay, so I just finished up how far I'm going to go with this damage here. This is a wholesale customer. We have more than exceeded their expectations. So I did that using tools that I would not normally use for this type of repair. So I'm going to show you the difference. So instead of using this, there's a smaller dent right here that I'm going to go ahead and repair with this tool. Now this is the large Fender dent from large Fender tool from Stanliner. I'm going to show you how much quicker you can fix fenders with this tool. So if you can't get your hands on this, don't sweat it. The killer whale tails will do a lot of the same things that this will do. Maybe not quite as well, but pretty dang good. So now I'm going to fix this smaller dent and show you using this tool how much faster it can be. Obviously that's a lot smaller than this was, but I think you'll get the idea. Now I'm not going to try to convince you that this is an apples to apples comparison, because obviously it's not. This is a significantly smaller dent. Now on realworldpdr.com you will see me fix dents larger than what we fixed at first, quicker, using these Stanliner techniques. But for now, let's just take a peek at it with this. So the way that I generally attack this dent isn't really going to change here. So we're wide open. I'm going to work this body line out using this rolling technique that I teach you on Real World PDR. Then I'm going to do some interior blending here, move whatever crown work's done. Let's see how we do this. So what ends up happening in the next couple of clips is instead of just racing through to get this done, I actually show off quite a few different techniques that can be done with this one tool. Each are going to take a little bit of practice on their own, but the more adept you get at using the techniques, the more you can blend them during your repairs. As you see here, I just went from interior blending to rolling very quickly, no gaps. And with all of these techniques, as long as you don't overdo it, as long as you don't push too hard, it's incredibly difficult to add texture. And with the last repair that we just saw, you can see how long it actually takes to repair that texture. That's why these Stanliner tools and techniques are amazing. Really what they do is they cut down on the amount of time that you're going to spend cleaning up. Now, we just showed with that first repair that we did that you don't necessarily have to have Stanliner tools to adopt some of the techniques. I use that interior blending technique with a lot of different tools that aren't Stanliner. Obviously, the Stanliner tools and techniques really do help, or I wouldn't be using them. What I really wanted to get across here was that you could still repair dents very cleanly with a basic set of tools using what I would call older style techniques. Well, I'm not going to spend a lot of time covering any individual technique here. I can assure you that all of them are covered pretty in depth at realworldpdr.com. All of them are designed to move a lot of metal fairly quickly and very, very cleanly, thus eliminating the cleanup work which we watched so much of on that first repair. Now, quite obviously, this was a much, much smaller dent. But the fact of the matter is that I had about 4.5 minutes into this bodyline fender dent. And suffice it to say, significantly longer on that first dent. The majority of that time was spent on cleanup work that could have been avoided had I been using some of these tools. Done. So hopefully you can see here, this could use a little bit of cleaning up, but honestly I put like 2.5, maybe 3 minutes into that dent. And that's why that large fender tool is so great. Okay, so there we go. Now, let me say this. Even though I may seem like a dent tools freak, hey, one thing I definitely try not to do is push individual tools onto technicians. I just showed you how to repair this fender dent without the use of Stanliner tools that I would normally use. That being said, had I used this large fender tool, I believe I could have got this done about twice as fast with less texture for myself to clean up. So I do honestly believe in this tool. If you can't get your hand on this one, a killer whale tail in a short version will work great for a fender as well. But you don't need it to do PDR. Sticking with some of the basics like that double bend dent crap rod that I was using will get the job done and get you paid. Thanks for watching. See you on the next one.